They potentially have a shortfall in the Climate Emergency Response Fund, part of that as well, which could potentially take it to 8. And then, of course, there's at least a $2 billion hole in their new foreign buyer housing tax as well. I think Christopher Luxon needs to be upfront with New Zealanders about exactly what it is that he is going to cut. Simply saying that he thinks that they can get back office efficiency isn't enough. Actually, there is no way to cut that much money out of the back office of the public service without cutting into frontline public services. When we announced some month or so ago that we were going to find $4 billion worth of savings, we set out in detail exactly where those savings are going to come from. Christopher Luxon's proposing to find savings in much greater magnitude than that, on top of the savings that we've already identified, and he's not telling anyone exactly what it is that he's going to cut in order to be able to deliver that. I think Christopher Luxon is treating New Zealanders with contempt. As I said last night at the beginning of the debate, there were going to be a lot of words in that debate. There absolutely were a lot of words from Christopher Luxon, but there were very few answers. Now, before we get into questions, I'm going to hand over to Barbara Edmonds to recap today's announcement, and then we'll go into questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Kia ora. So the government is continuing its work to support communities in cyclone-affected areas recover. Part of the announcement today is $10 million, which will be earmarked towards business support. So that's tourism infrastructure, workforce programs, as well as including projects such as in Wairoa, as an extension of the infrastructure, which is an extension of the airport. The government also today announced $15 million that will go towards Te Karaka. That is around the flood resilience plan for them with the Waipawa River, and that's to lift around 100 homes directly affected by in Te Karaka, plus another 100 homes which the Gisborne District Council will identify for the government.
Prime Minister,
yes.
You are here in your capacity as Prime Minister, and the announcement today is millions of dollars for people impacted by a fatal cyclone, and yet the first words out of your mouth are about National's tax plan. Do you think that's appropriate?
This is also my campaign stand-up for the day. You will have heard in there my comments on the announcement, which you were welcome to attend, so that you did hear my comments on the announcement.
That's pretty relentless messaging that you've been going pretty much every day on that. Do you think that it's starting to sink in?
We've still got a way to go before people start to vote, but I do think it's important that New Zealanders are aware of the risk of National's proposed cuts.
A number of people on a tax. Your latest ad doesn't even have you in it. How come?
This is an ad specifically focused on the National Party's tax and cuts plan. I note that in 2017, when they had an advertisement pointing out what they perceived to be the risks of our plans, Bill English wasn't in that either.
A number of people have called. Is your strategy now to ratchet up the attacks on the Nats policy? See the start of the stand-up.
We have been very clear over the last few weeks that the National Party's numbers don't add up, and that there is huge risk in that for New Zealanders. They could see the public services that they rely on, including frontline services like health and education, affected by National's cutting plans.
Do attack ads actually work, or are they just desperate?
I believe it's important that New Zealanders know what's at stake at this election.
A number of people have called last night's debate boring, or that it was even Stevens. Did you miss a chance? Did you bring enough fight?
Look, I believe it was a good debate. I think we had the opportunity to air a lot of issues. I think I made an attempt to answer all of the questions that were put to me, which does stand me apart from Christopher Luxon, who used a lot of words to say not very much.
Did you think it was boring? Did you think it was boring?
No, I don't think so.
He wants to ban cell phones in schools, but he says not the same for fizzy drinks. What did you make of that?
Fizzy drinks, banning fizzy drinks in schools is working. We've done it in primary schools, and primary schools have reported very positive outcomes from that. There's not just a good positive outcome from the teeth. There's also a positive outcome in terms of learner behaviour, in terms of not being amped up on sugar, and so it's working. And I don't understand. Last time they were in government, the National Party actually undid the healthy food and drink guidelines that have been put in place under the Clark government. And actually we saw things going backwards as a result of that decision. We're making progress there. I think, again, it would be a shame to go backwards, which seems to be what the National Party are proposing.
His priorities wrong in this one?
I think he's got his priorities entirely wrong. Schools can ban cell phones now.
Is recycling really all you're doing to reduce emissions?
No, I actually talked about the fact that as a consumer, I'm very mindful of climate. So that doesn't just include recycling, it includes minimising waste and thinking about the carbon footprint of the stuff that I am buying. That's something that every New Zealander can do. And yes, I have an electric vehicle, which has actually made quite a big difference to the transport emissions that I have. In time, I'd also like to move my own household onto other solar or other forms of renewable energy. Haven't had the opportunity to do that yet.
Have you been briefed on the Cryptosporidium outbreak in Queenstown yet? And what do you know of it, and how serious is it?
So the information, we're getting some further information through this afternoon, which will be publicly shared. I haven't had it this morning, but we know that there's about 15 people. The most recent information I have was about 15 people have been identified with it so far. They haven't been able to identify a common link between them. So in a similar sort of way to what we did with COVID-19, they do a form of contact tracing, which includes a bit of different information. So it include all of the food and drink that people have had and so on to try and identify where the common infection source might be. They haven't been able to identify that yet. They're doing quite extensive testing around water and so on to identify whether that's the risk. In the meantime, there are boil water notices in place for some areas, and I'd encourage people to follow those. There's also guidance that's been issued around things that people can do to slow any spread of infection, which includes basic hygiene issues like washing your hands and so on, but also just being mindful of the things that you might be touching where you could be spreading it.
I mean, is it serious? We know these things often start small. That was sort of the experience in Havelock North. You get a few indications and then it gets a lot bigger.
It's being taken very seriously. And that is why public health guidance is out there. It's why there's a boil water notice in place, and it's why they are sort of working very hard to identify where the source of infection was. In terms of the public health risk, we know that for many people the most immediate kind of public health risk is around dehydration, and so
from the illness or from the lack of water?
From the illness, because the illness exits a lot of fluids out of the body, and as a result, that can cause people presenting with dehydration in the health system.
The picture here is they don't know if the water's the problem because they can't test. They haven't been testing for Cryptosporidium, in the water because they haven't had the funding to implement that. The local council. How is that good enough? That an issue like this crops up and we can't know the source of the problem.
I don't want to take what is potentially a public health, crisis down there at the moment and turn it into a political football before we know what's actually happened there. As Prime Minister, I would say that our water infrastructure needs a lot of work, and the government has set out a very clear plan to deliver it.
Also, with your Prime Minister hat on, can I ask about the Christchurch earthquake this morning? Have you had any briefing or update on any damage, injuries? So far, NEMA, the fire service and the police aren't reporting any reports of significant damage. There's no tsunami warning in place. So at this point, NEMA have a sort of a monitoring brief over things, so that if anything, is subsequently reported, they've got a response that they can kick in if required. But at the moment, it doesn't look like any further response is required.
How do you think people will be feeling down there today?
Earthquakes always unsettle people. Certainly unsettle people in Canterbury because of their recent experiences, but actually across the country, earthquakes are always a bit unsettling, and a reminder that we live on we live on the sort of edge of the ring of fire, and natural disasters happen in New Zealand, and we have to always be aware that they can happen and always be prepared for them.
Back to last night's debate, did you play it too safe?
No, I believe I was respectful. I believe I made an attempt to answer all of the questions, and I believe I also took the opportunity to highlight what we want to do and the risks of what the National Party want to do.
Did you miss an opportunity to wrong foot Christopher Luxon?
That wasn't my objective. My objective was to participate in a debate, and that's what we did.
Intentionally.
Just back to the Queenstown thing real quick. Are you going to offer any assistance? Is the government going to come in and offer any assistance to the community there in order to get through this period, or to sort of better get a safer water supply in the near term? So
the Minister of Health is currently the Minister coordinating government efforts there, central government efforts, and if additional support is required, then the Minister of Health will make sure that whatever is needed is mobilised.
You just said it wasn't your intention. You wanted to go in there and have a debate, but why didn't you go in there and try and foot Luxon? I mean, there was a massive TV audience. Wasn't it the perfect setting for that? Oh, look, I believe I pointed out the risks of the National Party's approach, and he used a lot of words to not answer any of the questions that were being asked, whether it was Jessica Mutch asking them or whether it was me asking them. He sort of
uses a lot of words to say not very
Was
much.
it part of your strategy not to let him dig his own hole, as it were, as opposed to you interrupting more? Was that part of the strategy in your thinking?
Look, he was content to speak over Jessica and to speak over me. I generally am a bit more reserved on those things. I actually think people watching it on TV, having watched plenty of these debates before, prefer it when they can hear what the answers to questions actually are.
So that was part of your thinking?
Look, I think people at home would prefer to hear what people have to say rather than have people shouting over each other.
On the announcement today, so when you announced the $6 billion fund in the budget, it was called a slush fund. So how many more of these projects do you have up your sleeve before the election?
Electoral politics is not at play when it comes to these announcements. The reason that we set aside a $6 billion resilience fund was we know over several years there are going to be things that we need to do to build more resilience for natural disasters and in our infrastructure, our transport infrastructure and so on. We will fund those as we identify them and as they are ready to be funded. They're certainly not, the campaign in the election cycle is not playing a role in any decisions around that.
And up in Wairoa, there's a real sense of frustration that they've been forgotten, that they haven't had the attention that they should have had. Do you accept that?
I'm heading down to Wairoa straight after this, and it'll be I think it's the third visit that I've made to Wairoa. Many, many more were attempted, as you'll be aware, but we couldn't get there for various reasons. Wairoa absolutely has not been forgotten, but we are working on a locally led response here. I know the Mayor of Wairoa has been in regular contact with Kieran McAnulty, who is coordinating the cyclone recovery response for that area for government. We've got a very good constructive partnership there.
Every time it rains up there, they're really worried about what's going to happen because they say that there's nothing materially different now than there was before the cyclone. So what's stopping that happening again to these communities just as they're trying to rebuild?
So we've got a bit of an announcement about something that we believe we can do in the short term, which I'll be sharing up there, to build a bit more resilience into their transport infrastructure, to support them in the event that they find themselves shut off by road again. So we'll be sharing that news with them later on this afternoon. But I think we've set aside, we've made it a high priority to build more resilience into the roading system because communities like Wairoa shouldn't be shut off by severe weather in the way that they have been.
Would there be an
election?
election and his attack saying Labor's basically effectively in bed with the gangs?
I thought it was outrageous and pretty desperate, to be honest. Many of the programs the National Party are now criticising were actually put in place by John Key's government and were lauded by them at the time they were put in place.
Yeah, both you and Christopher Luxon said last night that you don't want to see cannabis decriminalised. Why is that?
I recognise that New Zealanders had an opportunity to vote on that at the last election and indicated that they didn't want it to be.
They didn't vote on decriminalisation, they voted on legalisation. And even those people in the No campaign were saying that people should not be prosecuted for a small amount of weed. Last year, 2,000 people were prosecuted. I mean, why not decriminalise it?
It's not a priority for me.
There's 2,000 people who are never going to be Chris Hipkins or Jacinda Ardern, right? Or Nicola Willis. 80% of New Zealanders at some stage smoke pot, right? Is it really reasonable to still be arresting people?
As I've said, it's not a priority for
Do
me.
you fundamentally think it should be decriminalised today?
I voted yes in the referendum, and I said so at the time, but I recognise that New Zealanders had a different view.
The Wairoa Mayor isn't afraid to share his opinion. Are you expecting positive feedback on the government's assistance over the cyclone?
I hope I'll get a mix of both, actually. We've worked very constructively with him during the recovery. No, constructive feedback. So, one of the things about having a working partnership like that is that you do want to celebrate the things that are going well, but you also want to hear where there's more work required. And part of I'm kind of wearing two hats today because obviously I'm campaigning for election as well, but part of my role as Prime Minister is to get out there on the ground and make sure that we're getting feedback where there are things that sometimes it's just a matter of wheels get a bit stuck and they need to be, given a bit of a nudge from time to time.
With your Labour hat on, you were lobbied pretty hard this morning for a Centre of Vocational Excellence based here in Gizzy. What do you reckon?
Are you asking me as Labour leader, are you?
Yes.
I'm very supportive of the vocational education reforms. Of course, I came up with them. But I don't think we'll be in a position to be picking, where those centres of vocational excellence are going to go. You have to have a process around that, which involves, people putting forward their bids, and the best bids ultimately succeed. And I don't think that should be a political process.
Would Gisborne be a good place, for example?
Gisborne, but places like Gisborne, regions across New Zealand, the intention around having centres of vocational excellence was that there's opportunities for every kind of regional and provincial centre in New Zealand to potentially to have one, because every region has its own strengths, and having vocational excellence centres within them is a real opportunity.
Speaking of how everyone has their own strengths, you were thrust into a fairly interesting situation with your video game skills on show this morning.
I was hopeless. I'll confess, I was hopeless. Did I?
No,
I don't think so.
Sorry, you didn't.
No.
Back to decriminalising cannabis.
I think, in fact, I died and I didn't even realise I died. So I think that probably shows how advanced my video game skills are.
Why isn't it a priority for you? It's not like it would take a huge pot of money or something to do. Why?
Sorry, what's that?
Why isn't decriminalising cannabis not a priority for you?
I don't think it's the number one issue we're worried about at the moment.
I have
There
some
was
about
a
farming.
bit of a success story for Te Runanganui this morning, but they're going to have the outcome of their restructuring process out this afternoon, and there are hundreds of jobs on the line. What's your message, to people who are going to be affected by this?
Look, I acknowledge whenever these processes take place, it's a difficult time for people whose jobs have been affected. We know that our vocational education system needed significant change when we came into government. It wasn't financially sustainable with its previous model. They're transitioning to a new model. That is a multi-year process to do that. So I acknowledge it's a difficult process, but I know that Te Pukenga will be supporting people who are affected through it.
So it's kind of an expected but brutal outcome of the reform, is it?
There was going to be a need for change for a number of people who are working in the former Polytech sector, regardless of whether the Te Pukenga was established or whether the former Polytech stayed in their previous incarnation.
Why have you failed to extend your increased Pharmac budget beyond next year?
We haven't released our further commitments around that part of the health manifesto yet, so just watch this space.
So, how much of a restraint would that place on your operating allowances?
As I've indicated, we haven't made our announcements on that one yet.
And what are you going to do to close the medicines gap with Australia?
As I've indicated, we haven't made our announcements on that one yet. There is more to come, specifically with regard to Pharmac, yes.
Do you do any debate prep with a pretend Chris Luxon?
I have done a little bit of practice where I had a friend of mine playing that role, but it was relatively brief. I was kind of more focused, to be honest, on making sure I had all of my relevant. You know how great I am with numbers, making sure that I had all my facts and figures right. Even then, off the top of your head, you still get the odd one wrong.
Is that friend Grant?
No, it wasn't an MP.
Did the
current or former?
Did anything surprise you about Chris Luxon compared to your friend acting as Chris Luxon?
The person who was acting as him was actually probably better at answering the questions.
We hear you just might as well tell us who it is now.
No, I'm not going to.
Can we perhaps hear from Kushla?
Yes.
In terms of how you're thinking, how it's going in your contest for the
Step
seat.
up to that.
How do you assess the mood post Mecca's leaving?
There's still a lot of surprise, but that's a conversation for them to have. What I'm hearing, I've had a very short run-in, but I've come into this committing to be the voice for Ikaroa Rāwhiti at a time where we need a strong voice the most. You've already talked about some of the issues, so I've come in committed to that, already traversed the whole rohe, and still very much a Labour stronghold.
Do you think Meka Whaitiri is a strong voice for the seat?
That's a question for the voters.
Do you think that she is, though? Do you think you could be a stronger voice, a better voice?
I didn't come in this to play marbles. I'm here to be the voice of Ikaroa Rāwhiti. And I believe, having traversed the rohe like I've just said, yes.
Do you think that she'll be punished for having her sort of hands on the levers of power and access to money at a time when the region needed it and then abandoned it?
Well, that's up to the voters.
How awkward was it rolling up today for this crew and seeing Kitty Allen up there in the airport today?
Well, I live here. This is my home, this is my iwi, these are my people, so it's not awkward for me at all.
Why is that ad still up? Yeah.
My understanding it was prepaid for the pretty much right up until the election. It's an ad for her as a local member of Parliament.
And Prime Minister, saying that Tamati repeated a number of times, push for Kush, do you think that could potentially confuse people on your position on decriminalisation?
No.
No. Very good. Tamati, perhaps some words from you on how you're feeling in your seat. How, in your conversations with people, how are people feeling about what's happened with Kitty, her decision, and you replacing her as the candidate?
Yeah. There is definite aroha out there for Kitty Tapu and how things went for her. She put a lot of work into this region over the last 6 years, but there was also a sense of relief that somebody with a bit of experience in Parliament has put their hand up to represent the people in this region who have needed some really strong leadership, and started this year with 2 Labour MPs representing it, and I'm here to finish what they started.
So you don't think it's eroded any support that Labour has within the electorate?
Oh, I believe that people of Tairāwhiti understand that Labour have been here. We've invested at a time when COVID's been sweeping through. There's all kinds of investments up and down the coast that the people on the ground are very aware of.
Is there a sense of frustration though, especially post Slash inquiry and the cyclone? There does seem to be palpable frustration.
About frustration at what?
The government response.
Oh, no. There's been investment. People understand it. Everything from the local pool down the road right through to the fixing up of the transport infrastructure, the Bailey bridges, getting rid of that, making something more permanent. People understand that the government have been there and continue to stand by them.
But do you find it a hard ask coming in, not only with short notice after what's happened, but also when there's this sort of perceived mood for change out there, when Labour is sort of struggling to get across to voters?
I think the people of the East Coast, they're pretty pragmatic. They'll take the best person for the job, and I'm hearing positive things in that respect.
Would you like to see cannabis be decriminalised?
Do I think that 2,000 people being prosecuted every year for minor offences, I think that's wrong. I don't think we should be spending our time on that kind of stuff. I've got my own personal opinion, and I voted yes for the referendum as well.
Have you ever talked to Chris Hipkins about your views on that?
We have good, robust caucus discussions, and that's for caucus.
Good luck.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Also, no profit money for co-op.
Sounds good.